And I stood upon the sand of the sea, and saw a beast rise up out of the sea, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and upon his horns 10 crowns, and upon his heads the name of blasphemy. And they worshipped the dragon which gave power unto the beast, and they worshipped the beast, saying, Who is like unto the beast, who is able to make war with him? This is from chapter 13 of the book of Revelation, talking about the prophecy of the Antichrist. A few verses later, it goes on to say, Here is wisdom. Let him that hath understanding count the number of the beast, for it is the number of a man, and his number is 666, or 666. Even if you've never read the Bible, you no doubt are aware of this number. You've seen it in a movie, graffitied under a bridge, or a very questionable tattoo on a very questionable person. And you probably have somewhat a grasp on what it means. A lot of people think it's the mark of the devil, which isn't too far off, but this number of the beast actually represents the Antichrist, the figure destined to deceive the world, rule with terrifying power, and wage war against the people of God before the end of days. A manifestation of evil on earth in the midst of the rapture. These days, we think of the Antichrist as a daunting prophecy. I mean, we've all been warned about its inevitable arrival, either in church or in movies like The Omen or Rosemary's Baby, or that uncle you only see a couple times a year. But here's the thing. For early Christians, and I mean 1st century AD early, this passage, that number, wasn't just some vague prophecy about a future boogeyman. A lot of these people believed they knew who the Antichrist was, and it wasn't some all-powerful supernatural entity. They believed it to be someone they'd seen statues of, the face on coins they used at the market. That person was Nero Claudius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, the young emperor of the Roman Empire, or as most of you know him as, just Nero. In his short rule of less than 15 years, Nero went from being one of the most beloved rulers in the empire to one of the most despised and infamous names in history. And not in the way of saying this guy was bad at ruling or politics. He could be compared to King Joffrey from Game of Thrones, a juvenile, narcissistic tyrant with a penchant for sadism. Except in the end, Nero made King Joffrey look like a decent guy, to the point that a lot of people, his own Roman citizens, thought he wasn't just an evil man, but literally the Antichrist. A man thought to be so evil that even after he died, others rose in his place, claiming to be Nero, come back to life prepared to seek vengeance. So, let's talk about it. What did he do that was so wicked that many people at the time considered him to be the devil's right-hand man? To the degree that even now, some biblical historians believe Revelation to be a historic text. In other words, the events of it, or the prophecies, have already come to pass, and a lot of their evidence for that is Nero's ties to the Antichrist. And all that and more is what we're going to talk about today. I will briefly mention again, the Brainwash collection is available now for a limited time. Head to the link in the description at wendigoon.shop. And thank you all for the support. It really does mean a lot. With that out of the way, we're going to go ahead and get into it. But as always, thank you for watching. So who exactly was Nero? Well, as one of Rome's most important historians, Suetonius, once said, quote, Nero degenerated from the good qualities of his ancestors. He yet reproduced the vices of each of them, as if transmitted to him by natural inheritance. In other words, this historian believed that Nero took the bad and left behind the good of what came before him. It raises a question of nature versus nurture, and Nero's nature was certainly of interest. As the 5th and final emperor of the Julio-Claudian dynasty, that meant he was a relative of Julius Caesar. The Julio-Claudian family line is known for establishing the foundations of the Roman Empire and expanding its territory, as well as creating significant political, cultural, and social changes that have pretty tangible and lasting effects even in today's society. Nero's father Gnaeus was the son of Antonia Major, who herself was the daughter of Octavia and Mark Antony, Octavia being the sister of Emperor Augustus, which despite having a child with Octavia, Mark Antony is most famous for marrying Cleopatra. Gnaeus would die before his son Nero's 4th birthday, and it wasn't that much of a loss. As Suetonius writes, Nero's father was, quote, a man hateful in every walk of life. And some of those walks included killing citizens for refusing to drink as much as him, killing a little boy by purposefully running over him, and gouging out a knight's eyes for being too outspoken. Which, to be clear, not like a medieval knight. Those would come sometime later. These were known as equites, which is like a horseback soldier in armor, which I guess is kind of a knight anyway. Nero's mother wasn't much better either. Her name was Agrippina the Younger. She was the great-granddaughter of Augustus, and while she wasn't as overtly violent as Nero's father, she was one of the most ambitious and ruthless women in Roman history. the apple wouldn't fall far from either metaphorical tree. Agrippina was basically the one who put Nero on the throne. In 49 AD, she married Emperor Claudius, her own uncle, and forced Claudius to adopt Nero when he was 12 years old. But this was a move by Agrippina to secure power for herself, since that made her the niece and now wife and now mother of the emperor's adopted son. Anyway, when he adopted Nero, Claudius already had a biological son, Britannicus, and a biological daughter, Claudia Octavia, from a previous marriage. Now, of course, as most emperors at the time would do, he had several other children by other women, but Britannicus was next in line to become Caesar. Or at least he was until the year 53 AD. It was then that Agrippina, again Nero's mother, arranged for Nero to marry Claudia Octavia, Claudius's daughter. So she marries her own uncle, who is the Caesar, and then has that uncle adopt her kid, and then arranges for her kid to marry her husband's kid, which again is her biological uncle. Aside from this being pseudo-incestuous or just regular incestuous, which was not really that taboo at the time, this was another big power move, as it leapfrogged Nero ahead of Britannicus in the line of succession. If it seems that Agrippina really had a hold on Claudius, then you're right. I mean, she probably could have convinced him to jump off a bridge if she really wanted to. But she didn't need to do that, as she just poisoned him instead. Okay, well, I should clarify, we don't know that she poisoned him. Claudius died in the year 54 AD under, quote, mysterious circumstances. And according to ancient sources, however reliable those are, he was poisoned with mushrooms, his favorite food. So when the Caesar was discreetly poisoned by his favorite food, I don't think it's too far to say the person who had explicitly positioned a bunch of people around him to make sure she stayed in power might have been at fault. That, or he had access to the Epstein list. So Agrippina managed to marry the most powerful man in the world. He dies for some reason, and then she promotes her son, a non-blood relative, to the throne, all within the span of 5 years. Nero assumed the title of Caesar, the most powerful man in the world, at the age of 16. At 16, most of us were getting our driver's license, skipping class, or trying to steal Spark Notes so we didn't actually have to read the book we were assigned. Meanwhile, this kid was ruling the mightiest empire in all of civilization at the time. Which, to be fair, a lot of people died between the ages of 30 to 40 back then, so it's a modern equivalent of like a 40-year-old, so that sounds better, right? But regardless of the era you were born in, 16 is the age where you're too young to know any better, but old enough to do some real damage. Especially when you have absolute power, unlimited resources, and a God complex. In 2 Thessalonians, while the Apostle Paul is writing to the church at Thessalonica, he refers to a figure that many believe to be the Antichrist. He says, quote, "Let no man deceive you by any means, for that day shall not come, except there come a falling away first, and that man of sin be revealed, the son of perdition, who opposeth and exalteth himself above all that is called God or that is worshipped, so that he as God sitteth in the temple of God, showing himself that he is God." Paul knew that false gods were coming, but for someone to be believed as an antichrist or a false god, they have to first look like a good one. That is to say, Nero didn't start out as a villain. His first couple years as emperor were actually okay, even good. The Senate loved Nero. He flattered them, talked about his desire to restore their authority by offering up some of his own. He lowered taxes, gave to the poor, and even had a tutor that preached mercy and justice. Chariot drivers, people who were like celebrity athletes in Rome at the time, got away with a lot. Cheating, stealing, robbing, but Nero put an end to that. He decided that even they needed to be held accountable. Nero poised himself as a man of the people, and the Senate applauded him for it. Importantly, Nero was also a fan of the arts. Actually, that's a bit of an understatement. He was obsessed with the arts. And while he was an avid sponsor of music and theater, funding them at a high level, he was also a performer. He traversed nearly his entire empire so his people could see him act, sing, and play the lyre, which is that little harp guitar thing that you see angels and fairies playing in old paintings. He didn't want to just rule, he wanted to be loved and famous. But the bad news for Nero is that, well, he wasn't really good at those things. How do we know this? Well, another famous Roman historian, Cassius Dio, had this to say about Nero. Quote, "He had, according to report, but a slight and indistinct voice, so that he moved his whole audience to laughter and tears at once." Imagine being the ruler of an empire and you go around, your empire to show off your skills at singing and music, and people laugh and cry at how bad you are at it. I mean, for all we know, that might have been why he went off the deep end. It took one child laughing at him on the worst day of his life to send history into a whirlwind forever. Nero probably knew he wasn't that great, which is why he had a hand-selected cheering section. A quote, special corps of about 5,000 soldiers called Augustans. These would lead the applause. So he would bring soldiers to applaud his musical acts. I imagine there was some pressure to go along with the performance and say he was good, considering, you know, that's the emperor, and those are 5,000 soldiers effectively working as a giant applause sign. All of that, by the way, and they still laughed at him. But what if, say for example, you were in attendance at one of Nero's performances and you tried to leave? Well, leaving one of Nero's performances was a crime punishable by death. Yes, it is believed that Nero forced entire towns to attend, with some performances lasting more than 6 hours, which, you know, feels a bit excessive. All of which you weren't allowed to walk away from. Some women gave birth to children there, while many who were worn out with listening, applauding, secretly leaped from the wall. He was so committed to these performances that Nero created a showcase called Neronia, which was effectively an ancient version of Roman Empire's Got Talent. He had special stadiums and stages built just for this, where he and other performers would compete for the crown in categories like lyre playing and orating Latin verse. It was literally a talent show with competitions in different genres. But any guesses who won all of them every single time? I don't know, probably the guy who, walking out on one of his shows, constituted capital punishment. Now, admittedly, this sounds funny to us, but in Roman culture, arts were not considered an acceptable pastime for rulers. An emperor's job was war and politics, not reciting tragic poetry for hours while locking the theater doors so no one could leave. Imagine if the president sang hour-long karaoke sets on national TV, forced everyone to watch it, and expected the Supreme Court to clap the whole time. Well, that's basically how the Romans felt. Not to mention that art was seen as something people commit their lives to, something revered, not something you do as a hobby while also being the emperor. Eventually, they began to hate him for it, especially the wealthy and elite. And I know what you're probably thinking at this point. Oh, okay, so a wannabe actor with a inferiority complex, and he's using his absolute power to force people to watch musical theater. Is that really enough to make someone the Antichrist? Well, yes, but it also gets much worse. If, you know, killing people for leaving shows wasn't indicative of that enough. It may have started with stage plays and performances, but at a certain point, Nero began wearing those costumes and wigs in order to disguise himself so he could go out at night. As Cassius Dio put it, quote, beating, wounding, and murdering. He basically had his own personal purge night anytime he wanted. He would insult women and sexually assault them, as well as young boys. He would strip people naked just for the sake of it. And if anyone tried to protect themselves or fight back, they'd be stabbed, killed, and sometimes thrown into a sewer. And this wasn't limited to violent, anonymous night crime either. Nero started finding more and more cruel ways to raise money and create power. He would design laws to look into people he suspected of disliking him, and then creating tax codes to take their property and wealth. And then there was the 5-6 law. If a lord or someone elite freed one of their slaves, they were then referred to as a freed man. Nero created a law that if any freed man died, 5/6 of his property would now become his, unless the deceased were part of an elite and powerful family themselves who was in favor with the young Caesar. Then they could keep their land. If not, and you fought back against his attempts to collect, you died. You were going up against the collections of the Roman Empire. This path towards fulfilling the moniker of the Antichrist was starting to shape up. I mean, think of the timeline. At first, he endeared himself to the masses by making promises, entertaining the people, and changing the laws in a way that seemed helpful. Then he hit them with the bad stuff, the true purpose behind those laws, the crimes, the suppression of speech, helping his rich friends get richer off the backs of people who were suffering. A playbook that is not unique to Nero, but he was certainly an early adopter of. In the year 55 AD, Nero decided to go into full-on villain mode. I mean, he probably didn't call it that, but same thing. Britannicus, if you'll remember Claudius's biological son, who was originally supposed to be emperor in the place of Nero, Britannicus suddenly dies at a banquet in eerily similar circumstances to his father. With Britannicus dead, there was officially no more rivals to claim the throne. In the midst of this, his own mother, Agrippina, began to turn on him. See, Agrippina didn't really like the way Nero was ruling, so she sat in on Senate meetings and meddled in policy. And you know, Nero being a young boy, like any young boy, wanted some independence from his mother. And by independence, I mean the freedom to spend Rome's money on parties and to sleep with whoever he wanted. This mother-son relationship quickly spiraled into open hostility, but it climaxed when Nero fell in love with his mistress, a woman named Poppaea Sabina, a beautiful young empress, and the woman Agrippina absolutely despised. Perhaps he was persuaded by Sabina, or maybe Agrippina just got on his last nerve. For whatever reason, Nero became determined to kill his mother. First, he tried it subtly, with poison. Seemed to be the family's weapon of choice. He apparently tried this multiple times with none of his attempts working, so he got a little more creative by, and I'm not kidding, trying to have a ceiling collapse on her while she slept. It is absurd how petty this whole thing is. His mother did complicated marriages and potential murders to get him installed on the throne. And now it's become, no mom, I want to go out with this girl. No, I don't like that girl. So he decides to hook up a Wile E. Coyote system to drop a ceiling onto her. When the ceiling collapse failed, shocker, Nero rigged her boat so that it would sink while Agrippina was on board. But she survived that too. After yet another Looney Tunes trap fails, Nero goes back to the basics, and he sent assassins to her villa who stabbed her to death. Which I don't know why Nero had to try to be cute with ceilings and boats. You can just stab someone. That always works. With this, Nero had murdered his own mother, the woman that brought him into this world and then put him on the throne. According to one historian, Agrippina's last words were allegedly, "Strike here," as she pointed to her own womb. If true, that's a very fitting way for a member of this diabolical family to go. Killing a parent in Rome was subject to a penalty called poena culae. Someone convicted of killing a parent would be sewn into a large sack with a variety of live animals, then thrown into the water to drown. Which, like, I'm all about the brutality of punishment for the dude that kills their parent. That seems pretty intense, cool, and whatever, but like, did you have to kill the animals? I know the idea is it's more terrifying to be stuck in a bag with like animals that are freaking out and attacking you, but I mean, like, they probably didn't kill their parent. But of course, Agrippina's death was ruled a suicide, not a homicide, allowing Nero to avoid punishment. 3 years later, he killed his wife, Claudia Octavia, by divorcing her, exiling her to an island, and then fabricating charges of adultery in order to have her executed, all for the crime of her being infertile. Some say that Sabina, his mistress, was involved in the execution as well, in order to have Octavia's head be delivered as proof. Which, not that it's a one-for-one, but connects Nero again to an Antichrist narrative, as it was Herodias, the wife of King Herod, who had her daughter convince the king to deliver John the Baptist's head on a silver platter. John the Baptist being the cousin of Jesus and a preacher whom Herodias despised, as John the Baptist had openly mocked her. This is also where the saying "head on a silver platter" comes from. But as bad as things were for the Romans, they were about to get a whole lot worse. You've likely heard the phrase "Rome is burning," and that comes from historical precedent. It was the incident that really cemented Nero's infamy, the Great Fire of Rome. 6 days of flame tore through the city. 10 out of the 14 districts were damaged, 3 completely destroyed. Thousands died, thousands more were left without a home. Looting and even more arson broke out. It was a truly frightening and tragic historical event. Now, to the public at the time, Nero did actually organize some relief efforts. He opened large military campuses and even his own gardens to refugees. He opened up temporary shelters, ordered food and supplies to the affected areas, and lowered the price of grain by a whole 3 sesterces, which, sounds like a lot. But even with all those efforts, another historian, Tacitus, wrote that, quote, "The report had spread that, at the very moment when Rome was aflame, Nero had mounted his private stage and, typifying the ills of the present by the calamities of the past, had sung the destruction of Troy." Suetonius validated this by saying, quote, "He sang the whole of the sack of Ilium in his regular stage costume." Maybe you're familiar with the idiom "Nero fiddles while Rome burns." It means someone is neglecting their duties and responsibilities in the midst of a crisis. Now, some historical conspiracies have popped up that perhaps Nero caused the fire himself, due to some of the events that will follow afterward. While there's not really a precedent for that, and he did do some things to help the people after the fire, he at best was horrible at reading the room, trying to make a poetic and artsy moment out of the empire burning, and at worst was neglectful and possibly sadistic, finding some moment of joy as people burned. When Rome stopped burning and Nero stopped singing, the city was in ashes. The next logical step would have been to clean it up, build some houses and other necessary structures that burned to the ground. But Nero didn't do that. Instead, with all the suddenly free real estate in Rome, Nero decided to build a massive palace in the heart of the city, the Domus Aurea, his golden palace, 300 acres of palatial complex on prime land. Inside, there were 300 rooms, and according to Suetonius, quote, dining rooms with fretted ceilings of ivory, whose panels could turn and shower down flowers, and were fitted with pipes for sprinkling the guests with perfumes. Nero also demanded they build a nymphaeum, which was basically an orgy room. You know, the root word there is nymph, like nympho. Yeah, basically a room for that. This was the original Playboy Grotto, and as if this wasn't ostentatious enough, there were also plans to build a rotating dining room that constantly revolved day and night, quote, like the heavens. Outside, there were massive gardens, tree groves, vineyard pools, and man-made lake. All of this was to be capped off with a 120-foot tall statue of the Emperor Nero himself, dressed as the sun god, standing at the entrance of the main hall, gilded in bronze. 120 feet is 12 stories tall. People are homeless and starving, and Nero thought to himself, I know what'll boost everyone's spirits. I'll have them look at a giant, massive, bronze, chiseled version of me. This did not help his reputation, as you can imagine. Instead, it sparked the rumor that Nero actually started the fires himself to make space for his massive palace. The land it was built on was a choice location after all, and if that wasn't true and he didn't start it, perhaps he just didn't care enough to stop it. The rumor and the idiom that he fiddled while Rome burned are the results of Nero's culminating attitudes on ruling. A Caesar who tried to become a rock star and strummed away while their home burned. The Romans were actually starting to despise him, and Nero could feel it. Even the Senate, who would have normally put up with many transgressions so long as the emperor kept him fed and paid, were ready to be done with him. Although Nero felt the shift in attitude towards him, his ego wouldn't allow him to accept the reality of why. And so he did what most other teenagers would do. He decided to blame someone else for the fires. And in looking for a scapegoat, Nero had the perfect candidate. A small, relatively new religious movement that had just popped up in Rome at the time. The Christians. Now, at this point in history, Christianity was a new and strange religion to most Roman citizens. At the time, Rome governed the land of Jerusalem and Israel, so a lot of the Jewish citizens that were being adopted into Roman culture had already professed and integrated their Jewish religion. But Christianity was a new sect that had appeared within this Jewish religion that centered around the belief that one man, a Nazarene citizen born in Bethlehem, was the fulfillment of a lot of the Jewish religion and prophecy. This man was accused by the Jewish religious leaders of being a heretic and was therefore put on trial and executed by the Roman government. And after his execution, his followers said that he had risen from the dead, fulfilling the prophecy. This man, of course, was Jesus Christ, and his followers were known as Christians. So to the Romans who worshipped a pantheon of gods, Christianity was very odd. Not only was the Jewish religion in the first place something most citizens probably turned their nose up at, Christianity at the time was an offshoot of that Jewish religion. So it was a belief that most citizens were either unfamiliar with or didn't care for within Rome. Christians didn't worship the Roman gods, they didn't partake in civic festivals, they met in secret, and they talked a lot about eating the body and drinking the blood of their savior in reference to communion. Which, if you're not in the loop, probably sounds strange, especially because they didn't partake in a lot of the other things you see out of religions from the time, things like sacrifices. The Christian belief in one god instead of the whole Roman pantheon almost equated to the Roman Empire's version of atheism. In other words, to a heavily religious society, they seemed unpopular, a perfect target for Nero to blame the fires on. The historian Tacitus, who hated Christians, so he wasn't just saying this, wrote that it was Nero who was responsible for spreading the rumor that Christians set the city on fire. Using this as justification, Nero unleashed a wave of persecution so brutal that it would become one of the core images of Christian martyrdom for centuries. Nero started by rounding up the Christians, arresting them en masse. Then he would torture them. If you're familiar at all with history, then sadly none of this is uncommon for typical dictator behavior. But the way Nero executed these people was so horrifying that even Roman historians, who weren't exactly squeamish, felt it was excessive. Quote, they were covered with wild beast skins and torn to death by dogs, or they were fastened on crosses and, when daylight failed, were burned to serve as lamps by night. Nero had offered his gardens for the spectacle, literally hosting parties and using burning bodies as lanterns. I mentioned the Apostle Paul earlier, one of the early Christians who was very fundamental in starting many of the first Christian churches, as well as writing multiple letters to these churches that now make up a lot of the New Testament in the Christian Bible. It's believed by many that Paul was executed by Emperor Nero shortly after writing the book of Romans, with many historical accounts believing that since Paul was a Roman citizen before he became a Christian, he was simply beheaded rather than being fed to dogs or burned alive. It's not hard to see why a lot of early Christians who heard Paul speak of some Antichrist that would sit on the throne pointed that moniker to Nero. It was also during this time that Nero killed his new wife and his former mistress, Sabina, kicking her to death while she was pregnant. Sabina's son from a previous marriage soon vanished under suspicious circumstances as well. Just about 10 years of his reign, Nero went from a quirky teenager who was very into the arts to quite literally the worst human in the world. This is the point where the title tyrant started to become the title of Antichrist, as Nero's cruelty became too much to ignore for both the Roman elite and the populace. I also have to imagine that, cruelty aside, Nero's erratic behavior and wild grand plans for rebuilding Rome must have concerned the elite for their own sake. I mean, as beneficiaries of the emperor's power, the benefits only went as far as Nero did, and it was clear his days as ruler were numbered. Eventually, the people had enough, and the Romans finally revolted. The city of Gaul was the first to take a stand. The governor of the province, Vindex, joined forces with another governor called Galba to challenge Nero. And while Nero's army ended up dominating the forces of Vindex, the idea was out there now that other cities and provinces had finally had enough. They were taking a stand. In other words, there was blood in the water. With the writing on the wall, the Senate decided to back Galba as the new emperor in waiting. The same senators who once praised Nero as a young genius had now officially deemed him a public enemy. He went from being the most powerful man in the world to a man on the run, literally overnight. Outside the city, Nero takes shelter in a villa and starts begging for someone, anyone, to come defend him. But no one does. And in June of 68 AD, with no one else to turn to, alone and abandoned by the people he discarded, murdered, tortured, and used, he takes matters into his own hand and kills himself. Poetically doing so in the same way he claimed his mother took her life, by stabbing himself. Nero's final words have been debated. Historians say that they were either, quote, "too late, this is fidelity," or, quote, "what an artist perishes in me." Okay, how important I am to the arts. According to Suetonius, Nero, quote, met his death in the 32nd year of his age, on the anniversary of the murder of Octavia, and such was the public rejoicing that the people put on liberty caps and ran about all over the city. So he killed himself and they had a big party. That's how much they hated the guy. But as overjoyed as the people of Rome were, no one had really witnessed his death. A fear lingered over them in the days, months, and even years that followed Nero's death. His reign had been so terrorizing that concerns remained that Nero wasn't truly dead. What if his death was nothing more than the death of the vessel his evil soul had occupied, and he was able to come back somehow? I mean, now, a couple thousand years removed, we're pretty confident that he's dead, but at the time, Rome was renowned for its gossip. Across thousands of taverns, bathhouses, and market stalls, rumors were traded like currency. And without proof of death, the way Sabina demanded to see Octavia's head in person, a rumor began to take root. This is known as the Nero Redivivus myth, or Nero Reborn. And it kicks off almost immediately after his death in 68 AD, in part because the official story of his death was hard for many to believe. He wasn't executed, he didn't die in battle, all they knew is that he supposedly stabbed himself in the throat. But his body was never seen. There was no parade or funeral with Nero's corpse. The door was open to question the official story. A lot of Christians and non-Christians alike believed one of two things. A, that he wasn't actually dead, and or B, this wasn't the last time they'd see him. Many believed Nero would rise from the dead, literally or metaphorically, and come back bigger and stronger than ever, and with a vengeance. After all, if Christ could rise from the dead, who's to say that the Antichrist couldn't as well? On Nero's death, Suetonius continued, quote, "Yet there were some who for a long time decorated his tomb with spring and summer flowers, and now produced his statues in the rostra and the fringed toga, and now his edicts, as if he were still alive and would shortly return and deal destruction to his enemies." Although there were millions who celebrated Nero's death, there was a small but vocal contingent of people who loved and celebrated Nero's life. When a celebrity figure is big enough, there will always be some fans, no matter how terrible they were. This contingent believed Nero was biding his time in the East, in an ancient Iranian empire called Parthia, where he was building an army of barbarians and Rome's old enemies. They warned that Nero was planning an uprising like none had ever seen before. And they were almost right. Maybe. Not even a full year after his alleged death, Nero supposedly appeared in Greece. Same voice, same mannerisms, he even played the lyre. He was, people claimed, putting together a small force of, quote, deserters, poor tramps, whom he had bribed by great promises. According to Tacitus, they acquired a ship and sailed towards Syria. On their way, a storm forced Nero's ship off course, making landfall on Cynthus, an island in the Aegean Sea. Nero and his crew threatened the soldiers there, telling them to join his uprising or be killed. Many of them joined, familiar with the unhinged emperor, and afraid of his wrath. In classic Nero fashion, he also robbed landowners of their slaves and made them join his army as well. Word eventually reached Rome that Nero was back. The new leadership took this news very seriously, as again, they hadn't seen the body. But not everyone shared in this fear. Led by the educated elites, many in Rome thought that the insurrectionist was likely an imposter. But in the Grecian world and in some Eastern Roman territories, enough people believed in this rumor that Rome was forced to treat this as an active risk for rebellion. It wouldn't have mattered if this was truly Nero incarnate or someone who merely looked and sounded like him. If people believed it enough to follow him, there could be serious trouble. I mean, it doesn't matter if the guy is actually Nero and Nero's not dead, or it's a guy that just says he's Nero. Either way, he has an army that's heading towards Rome. So the new emperor, Galba, sent several boats full of soldiers to the island where this new Nero was rumored to be taking shelter. But when they arrived, perhaps realizing he was seriously outmanned, new Nero actually begged the soldiers to protect him, asking them to sail him to Syria or Egypt. The captains of the boats reported all of this to the new regime, who instructed them to kill the imposter, which they did. Now, with a body, they had the proof they'd been missing. They brought it back to Rome with them, cementing the belief that Nero was dead, and this had merely been an imposter. And even if this had been the second coming of the Antichrist, he was also dead. Almost 10 years later, there were still some who believed that Nero had once again occupied another vessel somewhere else, and a second uprising was imminent. Man, this guy really scared these people. Around this time, a second false Nero emerged in Asia Minor, or modern-day Turkey, which is about an 11 to 26-day journey to Rome, depending on your route. Quote, an Asiatic named Terentius Maximus, according to Dio. Like the first false Nero, this one at least had a passing resemblance and also played the lyre. Did he win any Rome's Got Talent awards? Probably not. But he declared he was Nero and detailed how he escaped and eluded authorities, biding his time for his return. And people believed him, or at least enough to help him gather a small army and move west to Parthia, where the Roman rumors said he'd be. Turned out to be a really smart move initially because the Parthia leader hated the current emperor Titus and hated Rome. Using this Nero to sow dissent among his enemies was an intriguing plan. However, it did eventually become a bad move when the true identity of this false Nero was revealed. As it turns out, he was not the long-lost emperor. He lost his army and was executed. About a decade after that, in the year 88 AD, a third major imposter showed up under the emperor Domitian. We don't know too much about him, but like the false Nero before him, he had gained the support of the Parthians. Again, more than a particular belief in the concept of Nero reborn, the Parthians were probably hoping to use these fake Neros and the threat of a coup to be a destabilizing force in Rome. But this one, like the last, never materialized either. Even though each of the false Neros are eventually killed, the idea of his return never really went away. The false Neros weren't just con artists, they were the living embodiments of Rome's collective trauma. The Romans saw what Nero was capable of, the murders, the executions, living hell through theater. And part of them just couldn't believe that kind of evil could stay gone forever. So by now, the myth of the second coming of Nero brought something more than just violence. It brought prophetic fear. Pagans shared these fears too, but the Christians, with their horrific persecution still fresh in their mind, really had a hard time letting go. The idea that the Antichrist wasn't just some vague figure or some far-off future evil, but a very specific person was very real to them. Any day, Nero might come back and finish the job. I opened this video with a prophecy from the book of Revelation, which was written around the late 80s to mid-90s AD. Right around the time of the third false Nero. Like most of the New Testament, Revelation was written by a Christian, this one named John. Now, it's debated which John the author of Revelation or John of Patmos actually was, but we do know that it was written not long after the atrocities of Nero. To remind you, the verse began with, "And I stood upon the sand of the sea, and saw a beast rise up out of the sea, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and upon his horns 10 crowns, and upon his heads the name of blasphemy." You now are familiar with the belief that Nero may have escaped instead of dying by suicide, as had been rumored, and that he had fled across the sea on a boat to Parthia in order to raise his army. Well, a lot of early Christians combined what they knew of Nero with this prophecy from John's vision. Some believe that perhaps this beast rising out of the sea is Nero's army coming to Rome. After all, Nero had to take a boat to get to Parthia. And the 7 heads? Well, 7's an oddly specific number of heads for that number of horns, many relating it to the 7 hills of Rome. Well, a few verses later in Revelation 13, while describing this beast, it says, whose deadly wound was healed. And in another part says that they should make an image to the beast which had the wound by a sword and did live. This would relate back to the whole Nero reborn myth. Nero stabbed himself in the throat, killed himself, then recovered from the wound and rose up from the dead. And in another part of Revelation 13 it says, and it was given unto him to make war with the saints and to overcome them, and power was given him over all kindreds and tongues and nations. Many believe this to align with Nero's persecution of the Christians. And it's important to note that the Apostle Paul was likely one of the Christians who died during the mass purge of Christians after the fires. Again, historians are split on this, but there's a chance that Nero ordered the execution. So this beast of Revelation warring against the saints once again creates a connection. Finally, we have the big thing about the Antichrist everyone remembers that I opened the video with. 666. Like I said earlier, I'm sure most of you are familiar with it before you clicked on this video. But what you may not know is that in ancient Hebrew, which the Bible was originally written in, at least parts of it, letters double as numbers. This is referred to as gematria. And if you take the Greek spelling of Nero Caesar, translate it into Hebrew letters, and then add up their numerical values, you get 666. Now, a lot of this is theory, right? Like, oh, the number could mean this, it could mean that. If you take portions of Revelation, it certainly does have some symbolism that ties to Nero. But, and this is a bit more subjective, there's also a lot of parts of the Antichrist prophecy that don't relate to Nero at all. How it talks about people will accept the mark of the beast and then they'll be forced to have it. How there will be a captivity and a persecution and a war, miracles performed, all that stuff. In my opinion, I think it's more likely that these visions John had coincided with a real evil that had just occurred. And since it's John that just underwent this persecution who is seeing these visions, it would make sense that they would work off a point of reference he was familiar with, and was very familiar to the people reading it at the time, putting in context for them the evil that was to come. Now granted, there are again biblical historians who believe the prophecy of Revelation to just be a historical event. So the question would be, why bury this image in code? If he was really referring to Nero, why wouldn't John just come out and say, this is Nero? Especially after he's been dead and hated. Well, the counterpoint would be that you have to remember the Romans were still in power. And while very few people actually liked Nero by the end of his reign, the position of emperor was still borderline sacred to its people and often considered divinely ordained on some level. Openly stating that an emperor of Rome is susceptible to becoming an emissary for the devil would have been unwise, especially for a recently persecuted and relatively young religion. So if John was trying to talk about Nero, it would make sense to mask this inside of the cipher of 666, which early Christians might have understood as they were more familiar with Hebrew and more familiar with the connection to numbers. Regardless of which of the two or a combination of the two you believe, I think it's easy to see why Nero is considered by many to be a figure on par with the Antichrist. Nero may have died, but his image didn't. In Christian prophecy, he became a monster, and in history, he became infamous, a name encoded in sacred text that outlived him by millennia. People to this day still preach on the Antichrist, although that belief is mostly centered around a future being who will appear on earth in order to bring rebellion against God before Christ's return. So while most don't believe Nero is the Antichrist, due mostly to the time in which he lived, he is certainly one of the most significant of all the Antichrist archetypal figures, and probably one that inspired some of the language in Revelation. In some beliefs of Christianity, there are multiple Antichrists through history, people in each generation who rise up to war against the people of God. And if you believe in that, then it's likely that Nero was the first Antichrist. Regardless whether you believe the book of Revelation was projecting far into the future or encoding the happenings of the present, the shadow Nero cast over Rome, Christianity, and even the secular world was enormous. Moral of the story: always be like Sabina and try to obtain the head of your enemies for proof that they are dead, or else you may open yourself up to the appearance of the next Antichrist. You ever find yourself in that situation? Or maybe, don't give a 16-year-old boy the literal keys to the kingdom, especially if he has a weird relationship with his mom that ultimately makes him kill her again if you find yourself in that hyper-specific situation. And above all of that, I hope that you enjoyed this video, and we just want to say thank you for watching. The support on the channel has been fantastic as of late. You guys have been showing tremendous support, and it really does mean the world, and we all mean it. Thank you for watching. This is a weird topic, but obviously something that I find interesting and cool. And if you hated it and don't want to watch it anymore, that's okay. I will put more stuff that isn't this on the channel, but there will be stuff like this every now and then, and I only apologize a little bit. More content on the way, both here on Wendigoon and Creepcast. Again, the Brainwash collection is available for a limited time, and then it's gone forever. So head to the link in the description at wendigoon.shop to get in on that while you can. And if you choose to support over there, it means a lot. Thank you. Everyone who worked on this video will be credited in the description. Be sure to show them some love. They certainly appreciate it. And I believe that should do it for now. But before I go, we just want to say thank you for watching. We hope that you enjoyed, and we'll see you in the next one. Bye. And also, if you're ever in a city that's on fire, don't play an instrument, regardless of your political position. It just seems like an unwise decision.